Have you noticed? Technology is everywhere. Have you noticed? Technology is everywhere. You can't even change your oil anymore because of the microchips in your car. Everyone, you go to Red Lobster and everyone is looking down at their phone instead of their date. Technology is everywhere. And the relationship with technology, while we're dependent on it, can be a complicated thing. Police in Oregon were recently called to a home invasion, a burglary report. They rushed in to protect the resident of the home from whomever was invading the house, and it turned out it was a Roomba vacuum. You know what those things are? The little round vacuums that scoot around the house? Yes, it was a Roomba. In its activity was crashing into closet doors and bumping into walls, and the resident of the home thought it was a burglar. Needless to say, the police did not make an arrest. Relationships can be complicated. The relationships we depend on the most can be the most complicated. As we think today, as we approach another passage from Luke, be thinking about the relationship that we have with our government. An entity that, even more so than technology, that we are very dependent on. And our relationship with our government is extremely complicated. As we think about that relationship, let's read from Luke chapter 20, verses 19 through 26 today. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them. But they feared the people, so they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they remained silent. The next time you go to Australia, you may want to look at the money that you get in exchange for your United States currency. Recently, Australia's $50 bill was printed with a misspelling on it. In the small print, here we have E pluribus unum. They have the word responsibility on Australian money, and they misspelled the word responsibility in their $50 bill. And before they caught their mistake, they had already printed 46 million $50 bills. So needless to say, there are a bunch of misspelled bills in circulation. So take a look. Ironically enough, though, the Australian government has refused to release the name of the person responsible for the mistake, because apparently of how embarrassing that would be to that particular official. And that's our first point, actually, today, as we look at this story from Luke, this narrative about Jesus, something that is at work in Australia's money printing, something called political currency. We're looking at political currency today as our first main point. Verse 19, we have these chief priests, these scribes. They're upset because of political currency being spent. They realize that Jesus, it says right here, they realize Jesus has told the previous parable about them. What was the previous parable? The parable of the wicked tenants. that they are wicked tenants of God's creation and God's word, and they are upset about it because of the embarrassment it's bringing them, and they want to get Jesus out of the way. They want to lay hands on him in that very moment, Luke tells us, but they're prevented. Why? Because they fear the people. They're afraid that they'll lose even more political currency if they arrest Jesus. In fact, they're afraid for their lives. We already said they were worried that they'd be stoned if they even insulted John the Baptist. Imagine if they tried to grab Jesus, who the crowd is listening to. They're afraid of the people, so they decide they're going to let the government handle it. They decide they're going to let the government handle this crisis. As we read from Genesis 9 earlier, verses 1 through 7, we read actually the foundation of human government. We read the biblical foundation for human government, that it's all under God. God is the highest authority in government, but what was to happen if a human sheds a human's blood? Their blood is to be shed by a human. In our next sermon series, in Exodus, when we talk about an eye for an eye, we're going to deal with that. The retribution, the payback necessary by society, but that it is all taking place under God. These scribes, these Pharisees, these teachers of the law, these principal elders of the people, they have a problem with Jesus, and they have a problem with someone, and they decide they want to let the human government deal with it. A higher government than themselves. And that is a very biblical principle. They have the right idea, but what about their method? And what about their motives? The right idea, but what about their method and their motives? Verse 20. They watched Jesus, and they send spies. Duplicitous spies, people who pretend to be sincere to try to catch Jesus doing something they can turn him in for. I personally enjoy the rule of law we have in this country. I like the safety that provides. Not too very long ago, a certain summer, I came home several times and found the exterior faucet, the spigot on the side, the front of my house, turned on full blast, just spraying gallons upon gallons of water into my front yard. And it wasn't Sarah. She was asleep. Happened multiple times. And I thought, must be neighbor children. That would be a fun prank for neighbor kids. So I went over and talked to my neighbor, calmly, peacefully, and asked him if he knew of anybody who'd been turning on the faucet. And you know what happened? He didn't respond angrily. He didn't say, "You calling my kids thieves of water? You're a liar. I challenge you to a duel." And we didn't walk out into the street there on our forest lane and have a quick draw gunfight. We didn't do that. I said, "Do you know anybody messing with water?" He said, "I don't think so, but I'll check with my kids, tell them not to mess with your house if they have." We didn't shoot each other. And that's a good thing. We have laws in this country that actually prevent us from having high noon showdowns in the middle of the street. That's a good thing to keep us from responding as our emotions dictate. Because in the old days, go back past the Wild West, we can go all the way back to ancient times. We started hitting each other with rocks over it, whatever. We don't do that. We have the rule of law in this country. We rely on our government, on our magistrates, on our law to keep us from dealing with each other as our emotions, based on our emotions alone. But our Pharisees, our scribes, our teachers of law take that government dependency to a self-serving extreme, a manipulative extreme. They aren't concerned with upholding Roman law here, are they? They're concerned with their own political currency. They want the system to work in their favor. Which is, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm very guilty of this. Often I'll be driving, particularly on the interstate, but anywhere, I'll be driving along at my driving speed, and a car will come flying past me, will blast past me, will blow the doors off of me, and I respond, "You maniac! Are you trying to kill me? You're going to kill somebody." And then, every once in a while, something wonderful happens. Just a few miles down the highway, there they are, pulled over with the flashing lights. Like, serves you right, you maniac. Rule of law. But then what happens when I get pulled over? For driving too fast in front of Georgia Highlands College. As I told you that story just a few Sundays ago, what do I try to do? Talk my way out of it. Then I expect special treatment. I want the law to work in my favor to give me protection, but as soon as I'm inconvenienced, I want them to tweak the law. Let me off with a warning. And that's what our Pharisees are doing here. They want the law to be manipulated to serve their particular interests. They don't care about the real law or rule of Roman law. They don't care about that. They want special treatment. In verse 21, they send these spies to butter up Jesus with insincere compliments. Look at what they attribute to Jesus. Do they really believe these things about Jesus? They say, "Teacher, we know that you speak, that you teach rightly, with no partiality. You teach truly the way of God." Notice by doing this, they are sneakily they're putting Jesus in competition. They're dividing him from secular government. Because can any human government be described in the terms they use? Can any human government be described as applying the law with no partiality? As speaking, our leaders as only speaking and teaching rightly with no partiality? That our laws enforce truly only the ways of God? Can we say that about Israel's government? Can we? No. King David actually manipulated the law to commit adultery and then murder. Can we say that about the Roman government? Certainly not. That was a pagan government in the habit of abusing people, particularly non-Roman citizens. Can we say that about the United States government? Do all of our leaders only and truthfully speak the Word of God? Are all of our laws apply with no partiality, whether you're rich or poor? Can we say this about any human government? These spies are being sneaky. They're trying to get Jesus to condemn Rome and claim himself to be a higher authority than Rome, so that they can turn him in. And they utilize the one thing that makes the secular world go round. They use money, don't they? They bring money into it. You want to talk about political currency? They bring money into this debate. And it's important for us to realize as we move forward in Luke, to realize just the position that the Israelites were in. They are a conquered people under the Roman Empire. And Roman taxes on the Hebrew people were actually 1/3 of their annual income. Over 30% taxes. I don't know if you know your United States history, but I'm pretty sure we fought the Revolutionary War over a 2% sales tax. No taxation without representation, but here's a conquered people with no representation being taxed 30%, 1/3 of their income. What should people's response be? And they say, "Teacher, you know everything. Jesus, you teach rightly the way of God." How should we respond to 1/3 taxes? I'm going to read, if you want to turn there real fast, we're going to look at Romans 13, verses 1 and 2, and read what the Apostle Paul says about our relationship to the government. Romans 13, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul writes, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist incur judgment." Paul writes to support government and authorities because they have been appointed by God, that they are part of God's plan for the progress and protection of humanity. We're called to support governments and authorities even when they take 1/3 of our income. We're supposed to support a pagan state like Rome? What does that mean about pagan places like North Korea or Iran? These authorities have been put in place by God and are to be supported. What? What is this? How used are we? How used have we gotten? How used are we to Jesus' answer here? What does Jesus say? Render unto Caesar. Render unto Caesar. Now, taxes are very common in our society. They become a common part of our life because we've accepted that our society needs to pay taxes for civil protection, for civil projects, and even for foreign defense, for international defense. We've accepted taxes. But notice what Jesus is doing here. Notice how he works within the contrast between God and government. Notice how he works within the contrast, the framework that these sneaks, these spies are setting up. Notice how he works. He does not incite revolution, but at the same time, he doesn't allow for any compromise of godliness. No revolution, but also no compromise of godliness. Within his answer, notice your multi-tiered, your multi-layered responsibility. Don't hear a message of blind obedience to the government, but at the same time recognize that civil authority exists because God put it there. Because God has a purpose for that government under his divine authority. Notice that. But also notice, as Jesus illustrates, that goals are not always identical. I don't remember exactly the year. I think it's 2018 is the year from Back to the Future 2 when Marty McFly takes his time machine to the future. 2015, that's right. It's always increments of 25. That's right. I think 30, whatever. 2015, Marty McFly goes to the future, and what does he see in 2015? Of course, he was coming from 1985. What does he see? Flying cars. Cars that can lift off and hover. Talking to my dad, who was born in the 50s, that's what he believed we'd have by 2015. But we're in 2020. Look around. Where are the flying cars? Where are they? Why don't we have flying cars? What has happened to that dream? It's because technological research has gone a different direction from transportation. Do you realize that over 96% of the world's population is within reach of cell phone signal? Within the reach of cell service, over 96% of the world's population. So the science fiction plans and hopes and dreams of little kids in the 50s did not match up with global business interests. Goals are not always the same. Jesus' emphasis for believers here, recognize this, Jesus' emphasis for believers lies in the fact human governments and God do not always share the same goal. Understand, God's goals include human governments, but are higher and greater in scope. And that's our last point today. Different from political currency, spiritual currency. That's our second main point, spiritual currency. Verse 22, they ask, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Lawful. What are they talking about? Are they talking about Roman law? No, it's certainly Roman lawful to give 1/3 of your income to Caesar. It's certainly Roman lawful. They're talking about the law of Moses, known to the Israelites as the law of God. Remember again, this is the chosen people of God who are conquered and are paying 1/3 of their income to a foreign power, and they want Jesus to say it is unlawful for God's people to have to pay tribute to that pagan filth. They're trying to trick him into saying that. They're trying to use the division between God's goals and God's promises to his people and government goals and government restrictions. They're trying to get Jesus to use this division between human laws and real righteousness so that Jesus will say something rebellious against Rome. But in verse 23, it doesn't work, does it? Jesus perceives their craftiness, Luke writes. But he perceived their craftiness. And he uses the separation between human and divine goals to confound them instead. Verse 24, he says, show me a denarius, which is what? That's a Roman coin. It's a Roman coin that was paid for that's the, what do you call it? The minimum wage. That's the standard pay for one day's work, the Roman denarius. He says, show me a denarius, whose likeness and inscription does it have? And they answered, Caesar's. Duh. He made the money. He's the ruler. We have to give a bunch of these to him every year. It has Caesar's likeness and inscription. Your money in your wallet, whose likeness and image does it bear? The United States money bears the likeness of our national leaders and the inscription of our founding fathers, E pluribus unum. But it doesn't just end with our money. If you've ever driven to Atlanta, you likely used an interstate. That's where most of my people getting pulled over moments happen. What likeness and name does our interstate bear? Now they just print Eisenhower Interstate System on that little blue sign with the stars. With the full name, do you know the full name of the interstate? It is the Dwight Eisenhower Anti-Communism Interstate System. It's not just his name, not just his likeness, it's also got his ideals on the interstate. We should be familiar with what Jesus is talking about here with the denarius, whose likeness and image does it bear. Remember, Rome is in power because God placed them there for his purpose. And Jesus says in verse 25, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Render to Caesar. We could go all over the place with applications about this, but we're going to stay focused. Give to the civil government the money, resources, respect, obedience due any appointed authority under God. That's what Romans 13 was talking about. But again, Jesus illustrates the contrast. He says, but to God, what is God's? Sure, render to Caesar. Render the money, the taxes, the revenue, the respect, the obedience due and authority under God, but give to God what is God's. And what is God's? Everything. Support your civil government all the way up to the point where its goals begin to differ from God's goals, which are higher and nobler. See, while the coin may bear the likeness of Caesar, the interstate may bear the ideals of Dwight Eisenhower, the $100 bill may bear the image of Ben Franklin, all of us we bear the likeness of God. As we read from Genesis 9, we are created in the image of God. We bear God's likeness, and he desires that our hearts bear the inscription of his law of righteousness and love. That's what Jesus is illustrating here. We need to make God's law our filter. Make God's law your filter to determine how far you can support an authority in its goals. How far you can go in support of a secular authority. In verse 26, their craftiness has failed, hasn't it? As we read from Luke 11:31 earlier, Jesus is the one greater than Solomon. He has wisdom greater than Solomon, and his wisdom confounds them. Even his enemies are struck silent and marvel at his simple yet profound exposition of how governments and God's goals differ and cooperate. Start to notice in these words of Jesus how God's higher goals involve something governments can't create, a spiritual currency that governments can't print, can't issue, because if they did, they'd misspell the words. Recognize here what is going on. Verse 20, what are they trying to do? Let's bring it back to their overarching plan. Verse 20, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to trick Jesus into doing? In other words, what's their end game? What's these teachers of law's goal? Luke writes, they're wanting to get Jesus in trouble with the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. Who would that civil authority be? Who's the governor? A name you might remember, Pontius Pilate. Do you know him from anywhere in Scripture? Who is that guy? He's the very one who washed his hands of Jesus' life and sentenced him to be crucified. The very one who, to keep Rome in peace, executed the Prince of Peace. That Pontius Pilate. As we read also from Luke 11:30, Jesus said he would give them a sign that he was the Messiah, and the only sign he would give would be the sign of Jonah. What is the sign of Jonah? What is Jonah famous for? He was in the belly of the fish 3 days. And on the third day, he arose to fulfill the same mission he had before. How does that apply to Christ? Christ was crucified. Yes, Pontius Pilate washed his hands. Yes, the authority of the governor was used to kill him. But on the third day, he rose again to fulfill the same mission he had before, the salvation of the human race. That was God's purpose for that awful pagan Roman authority. His main purpose for Roman authority was to put Jesus in that grave that could not hold him. In conclusion today, see that Christ died to provide you with that spiritual currency you need. The spiritual currency to purchase forgiveness for all the ways you and even our noblest authorities fail to act righteously. Today, put your full trust in the authority that will not fail. Ask Jesus for the spiritual currency to buy eternal peace with God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, work in our hearts now. Make us marvel at Jesus' words, along with these high priests and scribes, stricken us silent. Help us, Lord, to be amazed that your higher goals not only include governments, but include our salvation. We pray these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.